Hi, everyone. This is a short video to go through an overview for Chapter 2 of Business 110, Introduction to Business. In Chapter 2, we're going to talk about economics. So I know for some people, economics can be a scary word, but this is just going to be a high-level overview of economics. You will certainly go through more detail in an actual economics class. But economics is really just how a society gives resources for consumption, right? So macroeconomics talks about the nation as a whole in aggregate, and microeconomics talks about specific behaviors and how they can affect certain markets. Resource development, how to increase resources and create conditions that will make better use of them. There's a lot of talk about this lately, especially in the Triangle area with transportation. The Wake County board has decided to do a study to see how we would feel about, how the taxpayers would feel about adding transportation. Because at some point in the not too distant future, it's going to be very difficult for people to get to work because there's so many people moving to this area. If you look at a city that's bigger, such as DC or New York, they have lots of public transportation to be able to handle that large amount of people. Different ways to increase resources: hydrogen fuel, hydroponics. So these are all ways of creating more, right? Creating more resources with whatever you have available. Adam Smith, known as the father of economics, he believed that freedom was vital. It was imperative that people be able to own property and to keep their rewards. So they have incentives. Incentives can be very powerful. That's something you'll often hear in economics. So he came up with this invisible hand theory. So he says, say you're a farmer, right? This is what we mean by invisible hand theory. Say you're a farmer and you've got 1 acre of land and you sell potatoes, corn, soybeans, whatever you want to sell. And the farm does really well. And before you know it, there's a farm, there's a plot of land next door to you that's for sale. And you say, I've done a really good job with this. I think if I got another plot of land, then I could make twice as much money or something like that, right? So you say, great. So then you say, oh, well, I need more people to be able to have all this additional land. So then those people that you hire then make money so they can go into the community and purchase their milk and their eggs and the computers and whatever else the case may be, right? So when you are incentivized to do well for yourself, it's going to lend itself to the community around it. Capitalism, stores are owned by individuals and not the government. So the United States is based on capitalism. England, Australia, Canada, those are all based on capitalism. State capitalism is a little bit differently when the state rather than private owners run some businesses. So countries practicing state capitalism, the most popular ones are China and Russia. And so they've had some success using capitalistic principles. If you look at a country like North Korea, which is communist, you can see why China and Russia have allowed some private owners to run businesses. Okay, so capitalism's 4 basic rights: right to own property, right to own a business and keep the profits, freedom of competition, and freedom of choice. And those are things that if you were born in the U.S. or any of those other capitalistic countries, you might take that for granted, that you get to own private property. You get to keep all your profits. You get to choose. Free markets, decisions about what and how much to produce are made by the market. Price tells companies of product how much they should produce. And consumers send a signal based on their purchase of it. So if you're a new business, how are you going to price? Well, if you sell t-shirts, say you sell t-shirts for $50, you're probably not going to have very many people who are willing to buy a $50 t-shirt, most likely. But if you lower the price to $30, more people buy the shirts. So even though you sell each of them for less, you could probably sell way more because that's what consumers are willing to pay. So the supply curve, this is the quantity of products businesses are willing to sell at different prices. So we can see here's the quantity of t-shirts and here's the price. If you're a supplier, you want to sell t-shirts for $50. But at $50, you would sell 50, right? You would be willing to sell 50 t-shirts because that is good. You're going to make a lot of money, right? So if the price is $5, you don't want to sell more than 5 t-shirts at that amount because you're going to be losing money. So this is kind of what we mean by the supply curve. The demand curve is exactly the opposite. The quantities of products consumers are willing to buy at different prices. So if you're a consumer, you're willing to buy 5 shirts at $50. It's too expensive. But if the price goes down to $1, you'll buy 50 of them. That's a good deal. So we meet somewhere in the middle called the equilibrium point or market price. And you find a point where it's the best of both worlds, where you're going to have the most number of demand at that price that you're still willing to supply it at that price. And that's what we call the equilibrium point. 4 degrees of competition: perfect, monopolistic, oligopoly, and monopoly. Perfect, many sellers, none large enough to dictate price. So we would say that corn could be an example of perfect competition. You don't have one farm that makes all the corn and they are telling all the other corn makers what the price is going to be. All of them make a little bit but none of them can dictate the price. And the products are rather identical. The next one is a monopolistic: large number of sellers, similar products, but the consumers view them as different. So if I asked you, each of you, which of these 3 is your favorite, and we could even add more, Burger King and whatever else, you all have perceived these as different. There's a portion of you that would always say McDonald's, a portion of you say Wendy's, a portion say Chick-fil-A. They all offer the same thing, right? They all offer fried chicken, except for Chick-fil-A. These guys offer hamburgers. They offer French fries. So we would say fast food is an example of monopolistic competition. The next one, oligopoly. Few sellers dominate the market because of the high initial investment. And then prices are relatively neutral. So breakfast cereal. If you were going to start a business, you're probably just not going to make a breakfast cereal because you have to go through a lot of research and development, testing, different recipes, and make sure there's demand for it. And, if you look at the cereals, there's a lot of cereals out there. So it's really hard to be able to be the best at that. But if you look through the grocery store or Target, Walmart, wherever you shop for your cereal, prices are relatively constant. And then monopoly: one seller controls supply and sets the price. So Duke Energy, any power company, that would be the same with that. So we talked about capitalism before, and now we have socialism. So some basic businesses, utilities should be owned by the government in order to evenly distribute profits. Okay. Citizens are very highly taxed, and government is more involved in protecting the environment and the poor. So a negative of socialism is we talked about incentives a little bit earlier, but there's few incentives for business people to take risks. And that is something that ends up being called the brain drain. So the brain drain is when some of the best workers in a country, say the doctors, the lawyers, the business owners, they move to other countries because, so say if you're a business owner and you live in Sweden, which is a socialistic country, you have to give up much more of your earnings than you would, say, in the US because they're a socialistic country. Communism, we briefly talked about that. The government makes almost all decisions. Prices do not reflect demand. We talked about that in a free market, that price reflects demand. But in communism, that's not the case because it's all managed by the state, the government. And it can lead to shortages, people being hungry, food, clothing. All right. And so a lot of countries today have moved towards a mixed economy. Some allocation of resources made by the market and some by the government. And this is the way the US, if you look at the US, it's trending towards a mixed economy. And then on the opposite side of things, China is also moving towards a mixed economy, but they're coming from different sides. GDP, total value of goods and services produced in a country in a given year. So high GDP allows the US to enjoy a high standard of living. we often, GDP is a good signal to see if the economy is doing well or not. And when the GDP goes down, it just means GDP includes businesses, government, consumer spending. And so when it's low, it means people are not spending for whatever reason. A lot of times that has to do with the recession, right? People don't spend when they don't have a job because of the recession. Unemployment rate, percentage of civilians at least 16 years old who are unemployed and try to find a job within the past 4 weeks. 4 kinds: frictional, you're in between jobs; structural, supply of labor is greater than demand. We see this a lot in blue collar jobs, unskilled labor. There's what we call a skills gap. So there's a lot of that with the skills gap because a lot of those jobs have moved to cheaper labor countries such as China and Vietnam and Philippines. Cyclical, when the economy is doing really well, there's a lot more jobs. Recession, less jobs. If you looked at the real estate market, during the recession, they weren't building a lot of new homes. So there were less jobs there. And then seasonal, depending on the weather, right? Retail stores during Christmas is a great example of seasonal. U.S. unemployment rate. You can see how it shifts there. You can see that in 2009, it was right near 10%, and then it started to come down. And I think now it's under 5, or under 6, which is great. Inflation. So basically means the general rise in the price of goods and services over time. How much can a dollar buy you? In 1950, you could get a bottle of milk for 25 cents. Now it costs you close to $4. We say that is due to inflation. Consumer price index often tries to see how inflation is moving. They look at certain items each month to see how the cost is. So they might look at a gallon of milk at several different stores at the beginning of each month. And if the price is going up, they would say that that's a result of inflation. Producer price index is on the supply side at the wholesale level. So if you're a lumber sale. Business cycles, 4 phases of long-term business cycles: boom, recession, depression, and recovery. Fiscal policy, federal government's efforts to keep the economy stable by increasing or decreasing taxes or government spending. So a few years ago when the government we were in a recession, there was lots of government spending. And the same thing happened after the Great Depression. FDR and his New Deal really, really increased spending. National deficit, when the money we bring in from taxes is less than the money we spend. National debt, the amount of government debt over time. And then surplus, if we took in more in taxes than we spent. That hasn't happened since Bill Clinton was president of the United States for the U.S. Here you can see this debt clock will show you how much debt we have. It is a lot. And then finally, monetary policy, the management of the money supply and interest rates by the Federal Reserve Bank. The chairman of the Fed right now is Janet Yellen. It's the first time it's been a woman. She just recently replaced Ben Bernanke last year, I believe. So when the economy is booming, tend to increase interest rates, and when the economy is in a recession, the Fed tends to decrease the interest rates with the hope that it will encourage people to spend and banks to loan money. That's it for this one. I hope it was helpful. Have a good day.